Roots of Despair. They called it the Reeves Tract, a long slice of public ground pinned between Greybridge and the old pulp mill where steam hung above the river like bad breath. The woods weren't prime timber anymore. Too many cuttings, too many ice storms. So the county posted signs about a bog restoration project that nobody read except the fishermen who want to know where not to park. The tract soaked up what the town shed: rain, ash, thin talk. In September, the dirt went to dust and shifted in slow drifts around your boot heel. By late October, it held water like a secret. If you stood quiet, you could hear it thinking. Dana marked lines for a living. She drove the orange pickup with 2 reels of flag tape and cans of spray paint rattling in a milk crate, 100 little plastic flags in a bucket, and a device that pinged when she dragged its wheel along a right-of-way. Her job was a caution you could see. Locate the gas and water and fiber before someone with a backhoe tore the world open. She was good at it in a way that doesn't show from far off. She could read a plat like a song. She knew how old plastic pipe rings under your boot when it runs shallow under fill, and how cast iron sings. She could smell a leak sometimes before her meter did, that coin-wet puff that coats the back of your throat. Her route bracketed the tract. New cabins on the ridge, a self-storage ribbon on County Road 6, 2 spec houses stilted up where the floodplain pretends it isn't. She de-parked the truck with its flashing beacon and kneel and roll a line of blue or red along the grass. She'd plant flags in a neat row and write, with her gloved fingertip, a crude little arrow where the cable jogged. If the ground was frozen, she learned to anchor the flags between roots. If it was dry, she watered a slit and slid the wire in. Work that low to the ground, you learn the way dirt speaks. How it crumbles, how it clumps, how it gives back heat at noon like a dog's side. She was in the habit of keeping to herself. She spoke to contractors when she had to and nodded to dog walkers and let the rest pass. People liked to tell her their projects. She'd learned to look impressed without letting her eyebrows go up and give them away. At home, she ate at the counter and ran the shower until the water lost its steam, and when she lay down, she kept her phone face down on the nightstand with the ringer off, because there are only so many things in a day that need to make noise. Sleep came like a backsnap when the body quits and the mind keeps turning a crank. Some mornings, she woke with the taste of metal, like she dreamed it was winter and licked a fence. On the Monday the first anomaly showed, she had 3 jobs on County Road 9 and 1 inside the tract. The last one was odd. A permit to trench for a drainage tile that the land trust had asked for. She knew the ranger who signed the request. Carson, a man who said "ma am" to women younger than himself without sounding like he meant anything by it. And she knew the board members wandered into projects that made good pamphlet photos. The trench line ran 50 feet from the fire road down to a bright orange stake someone had tagged with black marker, a heart and initials she didn't try to read. A low place had a stink to it like a sponge you've left in a sink too long. Mosquitoes, iron, that long, wet sock smell of bog water. She set flags where the water line ran. Blue blues, a neat soldier row. She chalked a white arc where the trench would go. The ground was soft enough that her work boot sank a little at the heel. She felt the give like a throat swallowing. She pulled her boot back and looked at her own print and saw water seep up in the shallow toe marks, like a person thinking about saying something and choosing not to. The spray paint crackled in her hand. It was a new can. It shouldn't sputter. She shook it. The ball inside rolled slow, as if the paint had thickened. She rolled the wheel of her locator and it squealed. She lifted it, and the squeal kept on for a second, the kind that makes the hair on your wrist stand before your head has permission to name why. She put the wheel down. The squeal stopped. A deer somewhere cracked brush like a man who doesn't know where his feet go. She heard a whisper. It wasn't a voice. It was what a voice might sound like if you pulled it long and thin until it snapped. It came up from the ground. It was the noise of water shifting in a tight place and air making space for it. She told herself that. She crouched and pressed her palm to the dirt. Cool, damp. A frost heave had lifted the mats of sphagnum the way a fat book lifts a thin one if you slide it under quick. Dana's father, long dead, used to say you can tell the ground you're on by how it takes a boot. Cat litter means sand, flour means silt, cold cake means clay, pudding means get off it. This had the give of something that wanted her weight and didn't. She stood. She made a note on the ticket. She put the caps back on the paint cans, the way you save something for the person who comes after you. At the last job of the day, an extension of a house on a road with a name that sounded grand, on a real estate sign and cheap when you said, "It in line at the store." She opened the glove box to find a stack of gas station receipts her brother had left the week he borrowed her pickup. The top one was new. She hadn't been to the gas station. The timestamp was smudged. The numbers ran like mascara. She would have asked her brother, but he didn't answer his phone much these days. She slid the receipt under the flap in the logbook and told herself pressure and humidity will smudge ink that no one intended to last. The receipt had a dampness like it had sat on a counter near a sink. The gas station counter hadn't been damp in months. On Tuesday, the radio at the ranger station sounded like it had swallowed soup. She stopped in to sign a claim slip for an extra set of county keys that weren't T extra anymore because the originals had been lost in April and found in August under a shelf welded to the shop floor. O'Neill, the ranger who did the day shift when Carson was off, sat with his boot on a chair and tugged at a splinter. The radio on the shelf talked all morning because nobody could find the right knob to make it stop. You hear the same morning voices your whole life if you stay in a town. The man who reads the weather like he wishes it would surprise him. The woman who tells you where the fender benders were. The little bit with the guy who does impressions you would not ask for. The radio had a buzz under it, a refrigerator-sick hum. When O'Neill swore at it and tapped its top with 2 fingers like knocking on a cake pan, the hum sang up and turned into a thin whistle you feel behind your eye. Dana signed the slip and walked out into clean air that tasted like metal on a cold spoon. At the first mark north of the tract, the little blue flag she'd planted the day before leaned toward the road. She didn't plant flags crooked. She bent and plucked one and found its metal leg bent in 2 short cuts, not a wind bend, but a knuckle bend, like fingers. She set the flag right and planted it. Icy water welled into the hole she demade and soaked the flag as paper head where the logo ran. The blue washed a little into her glove and made a tiny bruise on the skin between finger and thumb. She rubbed it and told herself, this is how ink behaves when the air is wrong. The odors shift all season, and the tricks shift with them. She tamped the ground with the round of her boot. It swallowed, then sighed. She rolled the locator wheel along the marked run and felt the old iron clank through the handles. This one should have been plastic from '86, but someone had spliced with what they had when the flood took out the lower field. She bent to write on the grass with paint, and her breath made a little cloud, and when it cleared, the paint had skittered into a different shape. It had pulled toward the ditch like syrup on a slanted plate. She watched it pull. She watched the letters of her own hand stretch. She wiped her glove along the line and carried blue onto her knuckles. The blue dried on the black neoprene like skin. A Sunday school little voice in her head said, "You should not be out here by yourself." The voice used her mother's vowels and a tone she never used when anyone else was in the room. Dana keeps such voices in the glove box. She folded a cheap paper towel from under the wiper fluid and wiped the paint off her glove until it was a dry stain. By noon, her phone buzzed. Her supervisor Hal texted in his old man way, public notice in effect, no ground penetration in buffer zones, Reeves and all ADJ units, more to come. She read it twice, You didn't feel the earth under you change and then see the county decide it had changed. Usually you felt it and then you watched men with clipboards explain it. She texted okay and added a period because she knew Hal would think anything else was disrespect. She ate her sandwich in the cab while a drop ran down the window from the seam in the weather strip and split and made two smaller drops that fell together and went where they wanted. A siren went east to west, not fast enough to make your stomach think of accidents. The fridge compressor in the ranger station kicked on, even though she was miles away. She could hear it in her head. At home, she let the shower run until it ran to lukewarm and then stepped in and pretended not to notice. She made coffee too late in the day because her head had stopped agreeing to be gentle. The coffee maker gurgled in its old throat. The paper filter sat a half-inch too high in the black basket like a hat, and the drip sounded wetter than it should have. She stood in her kitchen and listened to the room talk. The fridge compressor came on. It clicked. It clicked again. The buzz under the click had a Radio S rhythm, the way a train through trees can sound like wind if you ask it to. She slept like a tool you forgot to put away in the right place. She woke with the taste of iron filings. Wednesday dawned raw and quiet. A low cloud parked above the river. The smokestacks at the pulp mill put out a thready white. Somewhere near town, a train horn let go of a long note that went nowhere. She checked her email. The county had posted an advisory. Unstable soils in and around the Reeves Tract. Unusual undermining of footpaths. Caution advised. Trail closures pending. They enclosed a copy of a photograph whose color was wrong. The path in the picture looked like a zipper that had popped. A boot print had filled with water that was too clear. She looked for a credit. No one had signed it. Her first tickets were 2 driveways on a new road, cut in where the old saw house used to lean. The contractor had set cones in the ditch to show there was still water there, even though he wanted to tell his client he had a dry lot. The cones had grit on them like sand from a glacier. Dana marked the lines, orange and blue, and stood up and felt dizzy, as if the ground were a boat and she could see it was not. A truck rattled by, and its radio made her locator squeal even though the device was off. She tucked it in the bed behind the milk crate and stood watching the cone. It made a sound as the wind pushed it, a honk, 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 like a child's toy. It sounded like it had a cold. The third job put her back on the fire road at the edge of Reeves. She didn't go inside the gate. The advisory said not to. She set her flag row along the gravel and wrote "No cut" in jagged white letters on the shoulder. The flags leaned. She put one down, and it rose a breath and then sat. The ground moved the way a full belly does under a hand. She held the transplanted sense in her palm. I am above something that is alive and moving. She had been above live things before. A culvert where shiners moved in 100 flashes, a groundhog's run that put a shiver in the grass as it passed under. This felt slower and larger, like wind in a stadium roof. She told herself frost leaves again, and clay veins again and seepage again, the words people hold like talismans in a town that cannot afford science more than twice a year. She looked up the fire road into the bare trees. There were birch rags and oak arms and black spruce in a stand that remembers the last grant. The wind in the spruce sounded like a different season from the wind in the oaks. 2 feet off the road, the ground went to moss and then muck. 30 feet in, you see a lumpy line you can tell is hummock if you know what you're looking at, and just a mess if you done tea. In the middle distance, the ground was paler, as if someone had scarred the turf with a blade and let it heal. The pale line curved. It leaned in on itself. It made a shape like a circle with a gap. She had a father once who liked circles. He'd put bolts in coffee cans and line them on a shelf by size. He'd make a circle in sawdust with the toe of his shoe and use it to see if a thing was level. He'd say the only perfect circle in a house is a clock, and even it will lie to you. When he died, Dana had found a chalk circle under his workbench that looked like he had drawn it to talk to a stain that would not lift. She stepped a foot off the road. The muck took her heel and let it go with a sound like a mouth leaving glass. She bent, she touched the pale dirt. It looked like clay but felt like old bread. Her glove came away with a smell like pennies and mint. Winter clothes an animal. That stupid voice said you should not. She did not step further. People show their intelligence by what they choose not to do. She stood. She looked again. The pale line was not a circle. It was a broken ring, like a wreath that had been cut at the top and laid down and walked on, and then, because people are people, walked around. In the center, rushes lay bent. Not like snow had done it. The bend had memory and start. Her phone pinged. Hal, stay off footpaths, close as needed, report depressions. He had added 3 exclamation points that didn't sound like him. She typed OK and did not add a period. She flagged the depressions. She set 4 flags where the ground had gone soft. The flags bent in a way that felt intentional. She stepped back onto the road and wiped her gloves again and again on the thigh of her jeans and couldn't find the line where clean began. At the ranger station, O'Neill had a note taped to the radio. Do not touch. Tone testing. The radio's buzz had turned into a pulse. Every 20 seconds, a soft tap like a fingernail on a ceramic bowl. The sound of a person making sure a person is there. You get that soil picture? He asked. She said yes. He said, if they push the closures, we'll have people out there under tape in an hour. She said, they always do. He said, you hear at the store about the... And then he didn't finish, because it would have paled him to say it. She had heard. Everyone had heard. The group at the edge of town who 2 weekends ago went into the tract at night with thermoses and lamps and whispers and were not there when the first ranger truck went through at dawn. Their cars sat in the lot with frost on the windshields. One car had a coffee cup on its roof that had stuck a ring to the paint. Someone had found a circle near the fire road with broken reeds like a bad haircut and scuff marks like knees. The sheriff said there was no sign of foul play, so there was no sign, period. People say a lot of things, O'Neill said, as if people weren't the only ones saying them. She said, because she had no right to say more and no energy. On Thursday morning, the county posted the closure, the kind with a date you know will be extended. They set a sawhorse at the fire road with a laminated map stapled to it. The map had 3 circles marked in highlighter and 3 smiley faces someone had drawn in one of the margins, the kind of joke that is only funny held at the throat. She parked beyond the gate where the shoulder widens and is trustworthy and planted a row of flags where the waterline crosses under the gravel so the sheriff's kids wouldn't slice it with their quad tires. The flags leaned right, then forward, then left, then settled. She didn't look for a pattern because finding one would have required a decision about whether to accept it. The ground made a noise when the wind ran through the trunks. It would have been easy to call it leaves. It wasn't. It was lower. It was water or air moving through water, not in a pipe, but in a body. She put her palm to the gravel and felt a shake like the refrigerator at home when the compressor tries and tries and then gives up and then tries again. She closed her eyes and pictured the big beer cooler at the snacks and bait store by the river where the compressor kicks, and the dust on the coils smells like old bread when it warms. She pictured that sound under the road, in the ground, just at the point where you decide whether to kneel or stand. By noon, she had a voicemail from her brother that was nothing but static and the St. E.S. game. How had he gotten the radio so loud? And behind the static, a rhythmic click, as if someone were stepping down a stair that would not hold. He hadn't called in months. He sounded tired. He used the voice men use when they want to say sorry without saying it. She listened twice, and then told herself the tower near his place always 8 calls. Hal texted, "Bridge, overlay at Salmon Cut cancelled. Erosion under structure, county to erect, temp lights for alt route." She read that twice too. Slowly, the town was raising its hand to say it had noticed. The mill slid its whistle forward an hour to let the second shift off early before the dark made the river road mean. The price signs outside the gas stations clicked new numbers long after dark, an old habit of men with ladders who like to feel useful. After the materials store closed, she stopped at the supermarket for toilet paper and something salty. You could feel a town sleeping badly by the way the shelves look. The oatmeal was half gone, and the aisle with the bottled water had an ocean shape in it where a forklift had eaten an end cap. The store's music played too loud. The compressor on the bank of coolers by the milk had a cough. The scanners at the self-check made that little beep you think you can hear until it stops. She watched a man in a flannel coat swipe a bag of rice, and the register S light pulsed red, as if the machine were catching its breath before telling on him. The little speaker on the pole said in a pet voice, "Assist needed at self-check." But no one came, and the man put the bag in his cart and walked out the left-hand door that sticks in damp weather, and the machine said nothing else. On her receipt, the date printed once, and then again below, very lightly, a smudged shadow that wouldn't scan. She took the receipt out to the truck and looked at it under the dome light. 2 dates printed, one on top of the other, the top true, the bottom an echo. The barcode in the corner looked like grass bent under a boot. Friday rain. Fine, cold, correct. The kind of rain that takes the smell of everything wrong and sits it on your shoulder like a stray dog. Dana put on the county-issued rain shell that embarrasses by how bright it is and pulled her hood low. The hood makes the world a tunnel. The edges go away and the center gets narrow enough to make you feel brave. On the road above the tract, she stopped to put up 3 more flags where the waterline crossed a culvert. Someone had moved the first 2 40 feet down toward the low place where 4 trees fell over in a pattern that made the men at the store say wind can do that, and then not finish the thought. It is not what wind can and can't do you feel in the belly, it is how often. She did not move those flags back. She planted new ones where they should be, and after she pressed them in, she set her boot heel on the base of each and wiggled the metal into the clay, like she was towing a cigarette under a bar stool. The rain made a noise on her hood, like paper rubbing. The ditch ran brown. The brown took something from the upridge and carried it to the down. For a second, the ditch water ran clear, a line down the middle, then married back together. She put her glove up to the seam in her hood and pushed it against her forehead in the way of someone with a headache. Through the trees down the fire road, she saw the pale shape again. Circles do that to the mind. You see them where you shouldn't. You make them where you don't have to. This one looked less like a circle today and more like a body that had gotten up and moved and left a body-shaped hole it was going to come back to. She turned to walk to the truck. The ground under her left foot rose a little and set her down again. She didn't fall. It wasn't big. It was enough to make her heart forget its next job. She stood still and told herself she had felt nothing. She stepped. The road did what it does, kept its promises. She reached the truck and opened the door and sat and counted to 30, and then said out loud to the windshield, "No." She wrote her reports from the cab. She labeled photos she had not taken. She let the wipers thump when they didn't need to. She listened to a rain she knew and to a sound she did not, a softness under everything, a pulse. You can trick fear for a while with tasks. You can weigh it down with forms. You can organize it with blue flags. She had done all these things a long time. The fear sat anyway, a friendly animal without a name. The county closed the tract Saturday morning with orange mesh and those rubber feet that smell like old gym shoes when you carry them in a stack. People walked up to the tape, stood chewing their coffee, and then walked back to their cars in the wet. One man in a camo jacket lifted the mesh with 2 fingers like a skirt and stepped under it, and then, looking left and right like a boy stealing cookies, let it fall behind him. Dana watched from the shoulder while she wrote a ticket for a new mailbox post on Salmon Cut. She saw the man look at the pale dirt and then choose the fire road, because the fire road is always the choice. She finished the ticket. She noted the time. She put her pen on the dash. She waited. She heard nothing. The rain had made a music she had always called rain. The radio in her dash was off, and still she heard the swallow soup hum. The man did not come back for longer than she wanted to admit to herself it mattered. When he did, he moved with a good man's lazy stride, like he'd given himself time to see a thing and chosen to call it nothing. She drove home with her wipers off, so she could see the rhythm of the drops. Her apartment had an old smell when she opened the door, the kind that belongs to pipe and glue and the empty spaces beside things. She put the kettle on, and the burner clicked and the gas caught, and she stood with the handle of the kettle slightly off the ring, because you learn to do that when the ring sometimes sticks and sometimes doesn't tea. The kettle creaked. It has a sound when the heat goes in. She stood at her small window that looks over the carport and watched the rain lay a skin on the black top. The skin darkened and turned clear, lights reflected. A neighbor, the young man who runs his loud truck when sober and borrows rides when not, walked fast under the carport, talking to the air, practicing apologies. She made tea and watched steam pick up lint and carry it toward the ceiling. She stood in the hall and peed with the door open because she was alone and because she wanted to listen to the building. The person upstairs ran their shower and thumped once, the tender thump of a knee on tile. The fridge clicked and buzzed. The fluorescent over the sink flickered and then steadied in a way that wants a new starter and a person with money to buy it. She watched a droplet slide down the side of the kettle and stop on the rim, plump, perfectly itself. It held for 3 breaths, and then without getting bigger, it overran its own surface and fell into the burner tray and hissed out its existence. She had the thought that if she said a name out loud, the kettle would make letters in its spill. She did not say one. She ate the stale cracker left in the sleeve and felt her tongue's salt prickle and the back of her throat count the seconds. At the ranger station Sunday, the radio had given up talk and gone down to a soft electrical creep. It sounded like a record turning when no one has set the needle. Carson was back, had his boot up and a wrap around his knee that made a smile under his jeans. "We'll get a cold snap tonight," he said, and clucked like the sky needed convincing. "You ever seen the ground do a thing like it's doing?" Dana asked, because she wanted somebody else's body to answer the question. "There's pockets all along the tract," Carson said, and he pushed his lower lip out like a shelf. "There's old feeder streams and drainage tiling that made sense to someone with a mule and a shovel. It's been dry and then it's been wet and the old tiles have collapsed. Then you got peat. Peat moves when it wants. There's a shelf layer that goes like this." He made a dumb show with his hands, one dropping onto the other like a mouth. "And it collapses under the top crust, and then men like you and me go out to look at it. Talking honest, if the tract had its way, it would drink us all and go back to being its preferred mess. It's doing it fast," she said. "Can't really say," he said, and then blew air out of his mouth as if he had in fact said it. He tapped the radio with his nail, and it made a small friendly click. "We put in an order," he said. "It'll be spring before we get it." She said spring, and let the word be both a season and an action. She stood with her hand on the door, then stopped. "The group last week," she said, "the ones with the thermoses. Any news?" He lifted a shoulder. It was an old shoulder. "The kind of news there is," he said. "A car was found by the ferry. Somebody says they saw someone at the County Line gas station. We don't even know what we're looking at. The board asked for patience." The paper put an old picture of the tract up like that was anything but an old picture of the tract. He smiled, the unowned smile of men with no responsibility to lend comfort, and lent some anyway. "People go into places," he said. "Sometimes they come out. Sometimes they don't," she didn't say. "Sometimes they are in the circle they made of themselves, and the ground has a habit for it." Monday, the cold did what Carson promised. The frost stayed all day in the ditch where the sun never gets long enough to matter. The mud went to glass where your boot trusted. The glass took a perfect impression of your tread and then cracked like sugar. She marked 3 tickets and came to the fire road to replace 2 flags. They had blown down, she told herself. She set new ones and pressed her boot. She stepped back and the ground gave a small heave, like a breath held too long and let go. She put her hands to her thighs. She bent her head and breathed until the breath belonged to her. She took one more step down the road than she should have. The noise came up through her boots. It was not a sound as we say sound. It was a break in the true background. It was the moment a refrigerator motor is about to kick and hasn't. It was the water in old iron deciding whether to slap or settle. She bent and touched the road. Beneath the gravel, a larger thing turned, slow, like a hand under a sheet. She straightened. She lifted her arms away from her body, as if the air had gotten sticky. She said out loud, to no one, "No." That word had become her shut-off valve. She looked ahead. The pale line was closer, not physically, in perspective. It had rounded a little, as if mounded. The reeds within it lay in a compass. She turned away. She walked to the truck. She put both hands on the steering wheel and looked at her knuckles until they turned from white to something like normal. She started the truck and drove up the hill and did not look back at the mesh that made the world seem safe. Tuesday, she worked on the other side of town. Waterline at the trailer park with the paved loop and the maples that always have Christmas lights in them too early and too long. She flagged the main where it runs stupid close to the drive-in spigot the manager installed. She watched a small kid in winter boots stamp a pattern in the slush and then walk it like a game path. She smelled bleach and cat and a little something she didn't name because there is no point naming a thing a person is too poor to fix. Her locator squealed when a man walked by with a big stereo box on his shoulder. He carried all his music in a black cube that threw her sense of weight. She told him good morning and he said, "Yup," with a good and tired humor. She went to the doctor to have an ache in her ear looked at. The doctor had 5 appointments caught in the waiting room at once because the lab machine had stopped talking to the software that was supposed to interpret it. The fluorescent was at that hum that wants you to press your finger in the hollow under your eye. She sat with the ache groping down into her jaw and thought about the ground and put her phone on her knee and didn't scroll. A man behind the glass called her name and a printer bit off a sheet. Her name repeated 4 times, a stack of labels, one of them blank except for the ghost of her name printed beneath in grey. "Software," the woman at the desk said, and put the blank one on a small pile of other blank names they couldn't throw away. "I think it's my sinuses," Dana said to the doctor, who wore a tie she kept touching with 2 fingers like she was making sure it hadn't been an impulse and that she still agreed with it. "Could be," the doctor said. "Could be a tooth, could be a little bug." She held a light to Dana's ear as if the small lamp might tell her something about the larger dark. "You had any mold at home?" "No," Dana said, and then because the kettle sometimes left its old water smell in the tray, she said, "I mean," and then made a sound in her throat that was more about not wanting to be wrong than about wanting to be right. "Humidifier?" the doctor asked. "No," Dana said. "Try decongestant," the doctor said. She said it kindly. She lived in a town where people can only afford to try things. Dana took the paper for a prescription she did not fill. She drove to the ranger station instead of home. She stood in the doorway like she'd been sent there. "Oh..." Neil looked up at her from the radio as if she walked in on him talking to himself. The radio had no voice left. It had a pulse, a click, like the heartbeat of a thing you had left on a counter and told yourself you'd turn off in a minute. "You ever get a smell in your mouth?" he asked before she could speak. "Like carpenter's pennies." She said, "Yeah." "Carson says we're cityfied," he said, "which is his way of telling me to eat lunch outside." They smiled without joy. The radio clicked. The ground under the ranger station did not. It had been built on an old pit that was refilled with gravel and someone's idea of good dirt, and it held like a fake tooth. She stood with her hand on the filing cabinet until the click became part of the room. She didn't sit, because if she sat, she might not leave. On Wednesday, she went to move the flags for the last time. She had not decided to. She woke with her clothes on because the couch had seemed as near to bed as the bed. She put on her boots and her shell. She drove past the fire road and did not park. She went up the hill and turned around. She parked in the shoulder where the old billboard had once told the town what to buy. She got out of the truck and the quiet pulled at her shirt. She took 2 flags from the bucket and 1 can of white paint because she was out and hadn't gone to the store. She walked to the mesh. She lifted it a little with the back of her hand so it wouldn't squeak, because the squeak felt like it would make a line of fine china break somewhere. She stepped under. The fire road is not a road to people who have not walked it. It is 2 recessed lines with high grass between, where the tires of trucks have pressed the sand and clay, and the raised center carries what the deer carry. The raised center had sunk. The pressed lines were damp and not damp. She walked on the dampness for 3 minutes and then stopped and felt foolish for counting. She stopped because she saw what she had told herself she would not see. The pale line 3 shifts closer to the road than she had left it. And not the same shape, because everything is always not the same shape. The next time you look, that is how time works. But this different made a line in her jaw. It was not a circle now, it was an oval. In the center of the oval, something had pushed up and then fallen back. The rushes lay like hair. The air above it was cooler, which is not a sentence you can know without putting your hands into it or seeing the small breath fog that your mouth makes when you exhale, and the air does not care to warm you. She stepped forward 1 more step than she should have. She stopped. She said no at the thing in the air that made the pale dirt seem to breathe. Some things in life you meet because you were already walking toward them when you thought of what else you could be doing. She bent because her body chose. Her hand went to the ground. It was cold and wet, in the way a cow's flank is cold and wet in a barn that smells of salt and sweet. She pressed harder. The ground pressed back. She had the immediate and humiliating thought of being held. On the other side of the fire road, a tree let go a small load of water, a late rain falling at once. The sound made her body think of applause. The ground under her palm let go of a grip she had not admitted to and settled. She stood. She stepped back. She had the paint can up without deciding to. She shook it, and the ball inside trailed slow, as if the paint had thickened again. She wrote in white on the gravel, "Closed." She underlined it. She walked backward to the mesh, keeping the pail out of her back, as if it would be better to see it if it decided to move. It didn't. Why would it? It was ground. At the mesh, she ran into someone, not on purpose. She had simply backed into a person, which is an act that calls into question whether you have forgotten that other people exist. "Sorry," she said, before her mouth had decided to say it. "Yup," said the young man who lived under the carport with the truck that ran loud on some mornings and ran not at all on others. He had his hood up in the wrong hood for this weather, and his eyes were red at the edges. Whether from drink or from smoke, she didn't know. He held a thermos. He looked past her at the road. He looked at the pail. He didn't see it, or he saw it, and called it not a thing. People are allowed to do that as long as they're not working. He lifted the mesh with 2 fingers and went under. "My cousin lost her bracelet out here," he said, and he said it like a line he had been told to say to a parent who needed a story more than a truth. "Don't," she said, "but a Dante offered to a stranger is a seed you throw in a place you do not own." He said, "Yup," again, and walked down the road with a lazy brave that made her feel tired. His boots were city boots. They had a flat sole. They looked like furniture. He walked on the damp like damp is concrete. The ground did not care. He found a stick and swung it. He whistled a few bars that wanted to be a song his mother sang when she washed the floor. He went 3 shifts farther than she had gone, and then lifted his stick like a baton. The ground under his left foot breathed. He didn't fall. The foot came up wet. He laughed at himself. He looked back at Dana to see if she had seen him almost fall, so he could own it. She kept her face where she keeps it when she meets people she is responsible for, which is to say, nowhere the person will find offense. He turned and took another step. The pale line was there the way a letter is there for a person who knows the alphabet. He stepped onto it, and his boot sank up to the ankle. He made a noise in his mouth that wanted to be the word shit, and was the sound a mother makes to a crying child to let them know you are there. He pulled his foot back, slow, because he was a kid and had all the time in the world, and his boot did not come with it. He held his balance. He put his weight onto the right and pulled on the left. The boot gave a little, like a sweat, and then stuck again. He swung his stick down and used it to lever the boot. The stick went in. It slid like it had been buttered. He made a small sound in his throat and dropped the thermos. It rolled 2 spins and hit the little rise in the center of the road and stayed. "Take your foot out of the boot," Dana said, "because sometimes the simplest thing in the world needs permission. Leave the boot." He did not do it. He tugged again. He made a face like a boy who cannot believe a belt loop has betrayed him in public. He looked at her again. She pointed at the boot with her whole palm. She made her voice lower, not loud. "Foot out," she said. "Now." He pulled his leg. The boot slid in a soft slurp and let go of his foot, as if the boot had decided to change its mind and be a sock. His sock went in then, up to the ball of his foot, then let go with the softest pop, like a bottle cap pressed and released. He hopped back on one foot, his sneaker soaked and dark. He laughed because he had to. His foot went down on the road. He stood with his bare ankle wet and looked at his boot like it was a pet that had gotten itself into a slim hole. "I'll get a stick," he said, even though the first stick had gone away. He turned and started down the road the other way toward the stand of spruce, where the ground does feel more like a thing under a thing. "Don't," Dana said, and she meant it this time with the bone behind the word. "Leave it." "It's my boot," he said, as if ownership had anything to do with biology. "If you stand there," she said, "you'll go in with it." He looked at her long enough to see if she was someone he had to take in. She did not blink. He went under the mesh then, and she let the mesh fall. He stood on the gravel next to her and looked into the tract, and then at the boot, and then at his sock. He made a sound that was not a laugh and not a derision, something in between. "They say there's bones," he said, which is the kind of thing people say when they want to try a shape for what they mean. "There's roots," she said. "There's water. They say the old ones, you know," he said, and then made a shape with his hand, as if he had drawn a circle and gotten bored. He walked away toward the road. He limped a little, because cold water makes a foot behave like it had a long conversation with a brain, and didn't he like its conclusion. He got in his car and sat with the engine on. He didn't leave. He texted someone in a hurry, both thumbs. The mesh made a little plastic creak in the wind, the sound of an old swing in damp weather. The boot lay half seen in the pail. It looked like an animal retreating. The road breathed again, then didn't. That night, Dana dreamed she was in her father's shop, and the chalk circle under the bench had been rubbed to a smudge, and she knelt to draw it back, and the chalk would not mark. She woke with the feeling in her knee that tells you have knelt in a dream. She went to the kitchen and turned on the stove and did not put a kettle on. She watched the burner fire ring bloom and die when she cut the knob. She clicked it again. She let the gas talk and then caught it. She turned it off. She waited for the little tick-tick she could count on when heat meets cold and got it. She slept on the couch again, because the couch felt closer to the door. They pulled the mesh tighter at noon the next day and set sawhorses in a line too deep. Dana was supposed to be in the West District marking a sewer run, but Hal had called the crew and told them to stand by while the county figured out what to do with a bridge, compromised by anaerobic undermining, a phrase that made men touch their hats. She stood with a coffee and watched the men from Public Works stand in a group with their hands in their pockets and look at the ground like they might be able to shame it into obedience. The boot had gone by then. She could not say whether someone had pulled it or whether the ground had belched in a way people done it here because their mouths are too quick to fill up time. By afternoon, the local newsman stood with his composure and his eyebrows and told the town to trust the process. Behind him, the mesh shivered. A pine snapped off 20 feet up, and the top slid down the trunk like a man on a fire pole and stuck in the humps. The sound it made was not the sound of a tree falling, it was the sound of something heavy settling into a bed and deciding to stay there. Her brother called again, and this time she answered. The line crackled. The ground does not ruin the phone, the wind does. He said he had had a thought about coming up to stay a week or two. She pictured him on her couch and the couch flattening. She pictured his receipts in her glove box, ink wet. She said, "Now?" He said, "I'm fine here. It's just, if anything happened, where would I go?" "Nothing is going to happen," she said, and put her hand on her counter, which is the opposite of protecting someone. "You heard about the," he said, and she said no, like pushing a door shut before the rain. "Okay," he said, and because he was a brother, he took the hurt like a man and put it somewhere under his ribs. She made soup because it was cold, and a pot talking is good company when the rest is not. She cut an onion, and the onion made its little sob, and the knife did the thing a good knife does when you get it at the right angle. She put butter in a pot, and it foamed. She turned the radio on and then off when the hum under the voices found the pitch of her ear and laid a line across it like wire. She shook a pinch of salt into her hand and then put half back. She set her hand on the counter and felt the way the stove carried its heat through the sheet metal. She brought the pot to a simmer. She dropped noodles. She had the thought the water would skin with something she would have to read, and she turned that thought away with both hands. She ate at the counter and looked at the receipt she'd taken from her pocket after the market, because some objects act like sticks you can carry across the street for balance. The receipt's faint second date had darkened. She could see the shape of the 8's middle line like a finger pressed into pudding. She turned the receipt over. On the white side, a faint grey had gathered. It took a second to resolve into a shape because she did not want it. It formed an oval and then a ring, and then broke itself where she needed it to be broken to breathe. She put the receipt in the trash. She took the trash out to the carport and put it in the lidded can, and put a brick on the lid because raccoons and men will eat whatever they find. In the night she woke with the room so quiet she could hear the manufactured ocean of her own blood. She lay on the couch and put her hand on the cushion as if she could steady the building. The couch holds nothing but the person on it, and it did. Downstairs, someone's hot water heater coughed and then took back its cough and sat in silence like a dog told to sit. She dozed and woke and tasted metal and mint and then only metal. On Friday, she went to mark a gas line near the junior high, and something in the ground wanted to make itself known there too. It would have been better for everyone involved if the strangeness had stayed at Reeves. It didn't. The junior high sits on fill, atop the old freight rail bed. The cinder under the topsoil makes a sound when you shovel. The day was bright enough to suggest the world had regrouped. She set her flags along a neat run to the mechanical room and heard the faintest creak as she pressed the metal leg into the path. You can hear aluminum flex if you are kneeling, and the wind has put its hand on your ear. She pressed another, and the flag tilted toward the building, righted itself, and then leaned back the other way, as if to listen. A crossing guard blew her whistle at a car running the stop. The whistle had a cut to it, a note missing where the wind had decided to carry it away. She turned her head toward the river without wanting to, like someone had said her name. The line of maples along the edge of the soccer field held their leaves past dignity. In their shadow, the ground ran darker, and the darker had a shape that could have been wind, and could have been something a body would make if it had become too many small parts and wanted to be one. She went to the ranger station for a form. The radio had died down to a soft thrum you could pretend was your heart if you stood too close. O'Neill had from somewhere gotten a portable unit. It hissed and clicked and said nothing. He set it on the counter like a cat. "You ever think we ought to let the track do what it wants?" he asked, his eyes not leaving the portable. "I'm not paid to think that," she said, which was truer than she wanted it to be. "I'm not paid much at all," he said. "If I sit on the bench and count, is that work?" "Yeah," she said. He smiled the same tired humor as the young man under the carport. "Want a coffee?" he said. "No," she said, "thanks." She filled out her form at the counter and tried not to write the word circle anywhere on it. She wrote depression, which is a word with different uses that had all found each other lately. She wrote movement in duff. She wrote avoid trenching. She wrote advise alternate. She signed it with her name that looks like a hill and a fence. Her pen made a scratch on one letter. The scratch darkened. She covered it with the flourish she always regretted and then didn't. People stood under the mesh at Reeves all day Saturday. They didn't go in. They stood like zoo visitors before a slow exhibit. A woman with a red scarf said, "You can feel it," and no one said yes. A man in a brown coat said to no one, "Floodplain," and no one said no. Two boys threw stones, small ones, underhand, to see if the ground would notice. The stones landed in the pail and didn't bounce. No one said the word proof. No one said the word test. No one said a name out loud. The oval had changed. It looked like a soup bowl pressed into the duff and then lifted. The edges of the press had a wetness to them. The wet wasn't water. It was a fact. In the middle of the oval, the reeds lay in a pattern that would have been symmetrical if any of this wanted to make you feel good. Dana watched the group take turns holding out their hands above the pail like you would over a grill to see if it was hot. They talked low. The mesh clapped itself in the wind. The signs flapped and said closed in a language they didn't need to read. A mother with tired eyes set her toddler on the gravel, and the toddler made a sound like a frog would make if a frog could be disappointed, and then stamped up and down, and the road did not mind. A man with a drone walked along the mesh and looked at his little phone and said to his friend, "It's nothing." And his friend said, "It's always nothing until I have to fix the house." A retired teacher from the high school, the one who wore her keys on a belt loop because she taught art in a wing that wanted to lock them out of their own room, stood with her hands in the pockets of her overshirt and said, "My father used to say, everyone's father used to say, everyone mother used to say." The ground listened. At sundown, the group went away. Men from the county came with a roll of heavier mesh and zip ties that sounded like rat teeth when they pulled. They tightened the fence. The pail was there behind it, a polite guest half seen through a screen. Dana stood in her truck's headlight beam and looked at it until her eyes made it move. She turned the lights off, and it did not. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and had the conscious thought that if she drove to her father's place, he would be there. And then the second thought that the house had been torn down to make a storage yard for pump rentals. She slept. She woke with her hand under her cheek and her jaw sore because she had used her own hand as a block against her teeth. She got dressed in yesterday's everything and drove back to the tract. She intended to drive past. She parked instead. A frost rim had crusted on the mesh where the dew froze. Her breath made little lived clouds. The oval had changed again. It looked now like a hand had risen under a blanket and then relaxed and left the blanket lifted. She stood alone. No men at the mesh, no boys, no drone. The forest behind the pail had a good wind in it. Spruce. Oak. The oak leaves let go a few at a time like careful regrets. The spruce hissed. That could be enough. The road under her boots had that whisper above a road that isn't a voice but will be if you listen too long. She stepped back. She had the thought of moving the flags again so they would be nearer the truth instead of the line. She had the thought of rolling the locator's wheel along the gravel and listening for anyone. She had the soft thought children have of pressing her finger into a cake to see if it will hold. She stepped under the mesh, then because the mesh is for other people, it isn't for you. The first footfall had no story. The second had a sound like the time you put your heel down on a damp sponge in a sink full of water, and your heel makes the water go up around it, and your brain says, you have done wrong, and your heel says one more second, and the brain says, if you get away with this, no one will ever know. The third footfall went into the ankle. She pulled back and it came up with a kiss. She stood on the damp center and her boot left an oval that filled with clear water, and she watched the water not cloud and felt her heart count. Her mouth said, no. It was the only word she had left that made sense when your body is arguing with a place. The pail let go a breath. The breath wasn't air. It was not a thing she could name. It pressed at her jeans. She caught herself with her hands because her body had already decided what it would do if gravity made a suggestion. She felt the fine grit of duff and grit on her left palm. She felt something slide against the glove on her right, like a rope under a tarp. She pressed harder, and the rope was gone. She stood. She stepped backward. She felt something say, stay, in a voice that wasn't voice. She stood another second, because she always gives places a second to be wrong. She took another step back and caught her heel on the little rise, and sat down in the road, hard, her tailbone making itself known. She laughed because pain at the tailbone is funny if you let it be. She looked at the oval from her seat on the dirt. It did not move. Her breath made little clouds. She put her palm to the gravel and pushed herself up. The gravel said through her hands, keep silence. It meant nothing. It meant everything. It sounded like water running in roots. She stood and walked under the mesh and over to the truck and put both hands on the hood and put her forehead between her wrists and breathed until her mouth ran cotton. When she lifted her head, 2 older women stood near the sawhorses, watching her with the polite interest of people who have lived through many kinds of public embarrassment. One had her hair under a wool cap, and the other had that fine white hair that stands up electric in dry weather. The second said, not unkind, slippery, and Dana nodded. We were here years ago, the first said. They said there was an old stone circle in there from before they took the stone for road base. People say a lot of things, Dinah said, which had become her way to put a thing in a drawer. The second woman looked at the oval and then at the trees. You ever notice how some kinds of quiet don't belong where you find them? She said. Dana didn't answer. She felt the weight of the women's looking, their way of trying to decide if she would be someone they could tell their version to. She got in the truck and turned the key too hard, and it made that useless starter sound that makes a person feel silly. She tried again, and it caught, and she drove away slow so the stones would not pop like a pan of corn under her. People in town have long memories for places and short ones for rules. The mesh stayed up, and the sawhorses gathered graffiti that tried for jokes and failed, and men parked their trucks near the gate. The group from 2 Sundays ago was called a lot of names that no one had signed their own to. The paper ran another old picture. A woman with the weather in her face wrote a letter and used the word sacred in a way that made people annoyed with themselves for feeling it. A man who had gone to high school with Dana and moved away and moved back said at the bar where he works now that the bog has a stomach and it is time we feed it what we took away. He meant money, he meant attention, he meant nothing. Trucks loaded with pallets rattled over the bridges the county said were fine enough. The mill blew a whistle that made the foxes stop for a second on the berm and then continue. The The junior high kids made circles in the basketball court snow with their boots and then messed the circles up with their own hands, because one kind of order can be allowed when another kind of order wants in. Dana kept her head down. She marked lines. She wrote no cut and then undermine and then avoid. She dodged the friends who were feeling friendly and the strangers who were urgently polite. She turned the radio on and off, like a person tugging at a bandage. On the last day, the one I tell myself is the last, because I am telling you what I can stand to tell. Hal texted new instructions. Stand down, Reeves. Work west. The county has it. It didn't sound like him. It sounded like a man at a desk he did not ask to sit at. Dana took the road along the ridge because the river had made the lower road slick with ice near the bridge where the grade meets the hill. She parked above Reeves at the old billboard shoulder and looked down the slope through the trees like a person at a zoo. She turned the engine off and listened. The wind did its wind. The far-off highway did its tire song. A train hooted like a mistaken man. Underneath those, a pulse like a hand under a blanket let go and took hold and let go. She had the thought, knee to chest, old child's position, of going down there with a shovel and digging at the pail and putting her hands in the water and letting the ground tell her the same story it had told everyone else. She had the equal and useful thought of driving home, making soup, setting the spoon on the counter with the handle not over the edge, propping her head on her hand and sleeping until spring. She turned the key. The truck made the little whine that tells you it needs a battery you can afford, and then it caught, and she put it in gear, and she was about to drive away when she saw in her mirror the young man from under the carport in his wrong boots again. He stood at the mesh with his hands in his pockets like men stand when they have decided to buy something they can afford. He looked at the pail. He said a name. She could tell by the shape of his jaw and the way the breath left him. A name is a piece of a person. It fits the mouth like a tool fits a nut. He said it. He stepped under the mesh, gently. He took 3 steps onto the fire road. He stopped. He looked down. He said the name again. Dana cut the engine. She opened the door. She called, "Hey!" Sound carries odd in cold. It went nowhere. He stepped forward. He put his foot down. The road breathed. "Don't," she said, to no one and everyone. He put his other foot down. The pail drew itself like a purse wire. "Don't," she said again, as if the word had a job it had done before and might wish to do again. He took one more step because a human body cannot stop between steps once it has started without falling, and he did not want to fall. He did not. He did not fall. That's the worst part to tell. He did not sink either. His boot made the little oval and the water filled it and it cleared, and then, and only then, and in a way that can be called coincidence if you have a mind for that, the ground longed for him. It did not take him in. It held him the way your mouth holds a word you might say, and then do not. He stood in the road, above the pail. He straightened his back. He lifted his head to see the tops of the spruce. He did not turn. He did not look at Dana. He stood there, and for a full minute you could see nothing at all except a person on a road in a wood that wants to be what it was before the road was pressed through it. He stepped back. He came under the mesh. He lifted it with 2 fingers like a skirt again and did not smirk. He walked up the hill to his car. He got in. He sat. He looked at his hands. He drove away slow, looking not at the pail but at the road, because people have to look at the road or they will make more work for other people. Dana sat in her truck with her fingers around the wheel and counted to 60 and then to 60 again. She drove to the ranger station and signed nothing and said nothing, and the radio on the shelf clicked and did not. She drove home. She put the kettle on and then turned it off. She lay on the couch with her hand under her cheek. She dreamed that she woke and went to the sink and ran the tap, and the water ran brown and then clear, and then she saw her name in the sheen on the metal, not printed but raised in the film like a word in gum. She woke for real and the room had its quiet. She put her hand on the couch and felt the couch. She lay there until dawn, made the cheap blinds into a grid. In the morning she put on her boots and her shell and drove to work and marked a gas line under a street where the kids have put chalk games you have to step just so. She wrote "no cut" with her knife finger in the dirt. She planted flags, the flags leaned, then stood. She rolled the locator wheel and it squealed when she didn't touch it. She let just a breath of a laugh out of her mouth, because laughing at a thing you've done to control is what you learn after you've tried the other way. At noon, she drove past the tract and did not stop. At 3, she drove past again and did stop, and stood behind the mesh and didn't go under it and watch the pale, and watched it not be what it was and not be a thing she could put a word on. And she said to the old white-haired woman who happened to be there again, "It's still here." And the woman said just as gently, "It always was." And when the cold finally locked the skin of the ground, so good men could say, with the courage that comes easy, when a thing is already done, that it had been about nothing after all, that the ground had behaved itself, and that spring would be spring. Dana kept the habit of writing on the shoulder where the trenches could see it, avoid, with the arrow pointing where the ditch would want to go if it forgot itself. She kept the habit of setting the flag legs deeper than they need. She kept the habit of pressing her palm to the earth before she made a mark to see if there was a pulse worth respecting. When she washed her coffee cup at night, the water ran clear, and then not, and then clear again. And on the bottom of the cup, sometimes the film would shine with a color that is not in any paint, like oil on blacktop, and she'd swirl it once and let it break and then drink anyway. Because her workday was long, and because, in this town, a person does what they are hired to do and hopes the ground will keep them if they keep it. And because at the sink in a small kitchen on a weekday, there is nothing left to say to anyone, and the room has gone wordless, and the compressor clicks on and clicks off, and the lights hum, and the world adjusts itself, and the Reeves Tract breathes under the mesh like a patient under a blanket, and she stands and breathes and keeps the small promises she can. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.